Good afternoon to all the respected participants. I welcome you all to the fourth day of National Webinar on World Literature. Today we have with us our esteemed speaker of the day, Professor Sachin Ketkar. I'd also like to welcome my dear colleague and former head of the department, Dr. Rakesh Tripathi, and request him to chair the session. Sir, the stage is now yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Kundu. I again take this opportunity to welcome Professor Sachin Ketkar and participants from around the world for the fourth day of this session, this webinar that is in progress. Our topic for today's session is World Literature and Literary Historiography, which in itself is quite an interesting and challenging area. In fact, while I was going through Professor Ketkar's profile, I felt that this is one area that's obviously getting redefined because of the dynamics of the environment we live in. And the work that Professor Ketkar that you have done is indeed a great step in this direction. So on behalf of Sri Sri University and my colleagues, I once again welcome you to this webinar. And I'm sure our participants are going to enjoy all the interaction that will be there today. Whatever questions we have, we can have them placed at the end of the session once the talk is over. And I'm sure this is going to be quite engaging for all of us. So the stage is all set now. I hand over the stage to Professor Ketkar. Let us all welcome him. Thank you so much. So kindly unmute yourself.
Hello, Rakesh sir. Please introduce Professor Sachin Ketkar, the bio note. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go through that quickly. Yes. In fact, before I set on, I start with Professor Ketkar's introduction, a brief concept note as well I'd like to share with all the participants. The session today will focus on national literature, comparative literature, and world literature. And we'll also look at the transmission and consumption of literary texts along with their production, along with the epistemologies and philosophies of across spatio-temporal dimensions, national delimitations within the context of an international setting. It will also address the transformation of the concept from Goethe to Damraj via Tagore and map newer researchers from different points of view. It will survey the critique of the concept world literature, as I just said a little while ago, and also in order to draw a complete picture of it. Our speaker for today's session, Professor Sachin C. Ketkar, is a bilingual writer, translator, editor, blogger, and researcher based at Baroda, Gujarat. His collections of Marathi poetry are Jaranya Sadhancha Blogvarche and Bhinte Vaishya Kidik Dokat Vatna. I'm sorry for the pronunciations, if at all there are any errors. The words are a little typical. His poems have been translated into Gujarati, Hindi, Urdu, Malayalam, and Telugu. That's quite a variety in itself. And also, we have some of the works like Changlya Kavitalche, Warning, Samkalin Marathi Kavita, and some other works which are there in Marathi, which relate to contemporary Marathi poetry, globalization. His books in English include Skin, Spam and Other Fake Encounters, Selected Poems and in Translation, and Migrating Words, that's a work on Indian translation studies, and A Dirge for the Dead Dog and Other Incantations way back in 2003. He has extensively translated present-day Marathi poetry, most of which is collected in the anthology Live Update, an anthology of recent Marathi poetry, edited by him in 2005. Apart from rendering the 15th century Gujarati poet Narsingh Mehta for his doctoral research, he has also translated numerous Gujarati writers like Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, Bhupen Kakkar, Jayant Khatri, Rajendra Patel, Jayadev Shukla, Rajesh Pandya, Nazir Mansoori, and Mona Patrawala into English. He won the English Literature Poetry Translation Prize given by the Indian Literature Journal Sahitya Akademi, New Delhi for the translation of modern Gujarati poetry in 2000. He has translated fiction by Yog Louis Borges, Ted Hughes, and Adam Thorpe into Marathi. He works as a professor of English, Faculty of Arts, the Maharaja Sayajirao University, Baroda, and currently he is working on a critical history of Marathi literature. So I take this opportunity to welcome him once again, and let us all listen to what his views are on world literature and literary historiography.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Professor Tripathi. I hope I'm audible enough. Yeah. I want to thank, first of all, Sri Sri University and the Department of English, Professor Rindan Kundu in particular, for having me here. And I'm excited to be with all of you. Some of you are distinguished scholars, some of you are students, and at various stages of your careers as researchers and teachers. So it's a pleasure for me to be with all of you. And I would also like to thank Dr. Kundu for giving me an opportunity to share from my work, the ongoing work that I have just now and which is in press, being edited. And the work that I will be talking about is from critical history of Marathi literature. And whatever I say is part of the arguments that I have developed in the book. So one of the basic arguments that I am developing is that the idea of world literature is one of the ways through which you can reconceptualize the ways by which we talk of Bhasha literary histories or the vernacular literary histories in India. So that is one of the arguments that I have made. So it fits into the theme of the seminar, and I'm sure all of you must have heard from very distinguished scholars that have preceded me about various theorizations of world literature. However, I am looking at something far more specific, and that is looking at Marathi literary history. And I'm sure it will connect with other literary histories and the histories that
Yeah.
Is there. I will start sharing my screen, and I will talk about what I have to say as we move ahead. Is my screen visible? Am I able?
Yeah. Yes, sir, visible.
Yeah, thank you. So as you can see from the title that I've selected, the literary historiography as an area is a vast area, and I don't think I will be able to do justice to the entire field in given 1 hour. So I'm just going to focus on a small aspect of pre-colonial literature. Because most of the time when we talk of world literature, it is not very difficult to understand world literature after onset of colonial modernity and colonial history, because then Indian literatures get some way integrated in the global world system of literary historiography. And then with the rise of capitalism, it's easy to understand how world literature and global markets function. So I'm going to look at something that does not fall into this obvious domain, though in my book I have dealt with it at length. I'm going to look at small aspect of pre-colonial literatures. I'm going to focus on a very small section of Bhakti texts, with the view of bringing into it the question of world literature. Yeah, so this is what I want to say. This slide is a kind of summary of what I'm trying to say in the course of this presentation, that though the contemporary theoretical formulations of world literature by Pascal Casanova, Marathi, David Damrosch, I'm sure many learned people who have preceded me have talked at length about some of these ideas, are critiqued for the implication of the notion of world literature with capitalist neoliberalism and Eurocentrism. I have tried to argue in my book that certain notions of world literature, and given the fact that world literature is not a singular idea, it's not a single concept, but it consists of multiple models of world literature. Certain models of world literature, like the one by Dionys Durizin and David Damrosch, can be fruitfully used in literary and cultural historiography of South Asia, as they can provide a mode for underscoring multiple dialogic processes and textual circulation in the wider multilingual, diverse cultural context of South Asia. And the argument that I'm building is that these use of these notions of world literature can help us to move beyond the typical post-colonial nationalist/nativist approaches on one hand, and the South Asianist Sanskrit-centered approaches based on the notion of vernacularization in the conceptualization of Bhakti literature. These ideas of world literature can help us to move beyond these established approaches or paradigms of world literature. That is a kind of, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say. These are the critiques of world literature, which I'm not going into great detail, but as people have said, that the idea of world literature is a hegemonic force in English humanities today. And it's fast becoming the way to theorize any literary field. A very famous use of world literature in literary historiography is a more recent book by Walter Cohen called A History of European Literature. And this book, he says that if prose literature from around the world now draws centrally from the Western forms, and especially on the novel, why not see all of it as world literature? Means what he is trying to say, why not look at Bangla novel as world literature as Western literature? Or why not see Marathi novel as Western literature? So that's a kind of provocative statement that he is making, and he is saying that European literature it becomes central to his conceptualization of world literature, because Europe is at the center stage of world literary developments, according to Walter Cohen. So you can see the implicit Eurocentric bias in thinking about literary history and world literature, especially even in so recent book as a 2017 book. All of you, I think, must have been quite acquainted with the ideas of David Damrosch and his theory of world literature as something that, as text that encompasses all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original work. A work only has an effective life as world literature whenever it's actively present within a literary system beyond that original culture. And very famously, he has argued that it's not an infinite, ungraspable canon, but rather a mode of circulation and of reading mode that is applicable to individual works as well as bodies of material available for reading the classics. Obviously, you must have heard these ideas. It's just a kind of brushing it up just because I draw upon this idea for my own research purpose and the argument that I am making right now. And then he says, this is something critical to my project, is that world literature is almost always experienced by readers within the national context in which they live. And he goes on to say that in a kind of figure ground reversal, it is the nation that frames the experiences of world literature as much as world literature that frames any national canon. So he reverses this figure background trope to look into, and he asks the scholars to delve more into national world literature as it exists within the national. So I think as national literary traditions themselves are never self-contained, as nationalistic literary histories have often supposed, is what he says. And this conception by David Domrosh can help us to look at texts like Bhagavad Gita or the epics or Bhakti poets like Kabir or modern literature like Tagore or the genres like ghazal and novel as world literature. But it also allows us to understand the genres of reading like literary criticism and literary history as forms of world literature as well. So this is one strand which I have touched upon, that literary historiography itself is a kind of world literature as a mode of reading, as a mode of research. What I'm going to do is I'm going to first give a kind of touch upon how nationalist readings of Bhakti literature and South Asianist readings of Marathi Bhakti literature have approached the subject, and how my approach differs critically from these approaches. And this is just a brief in a nutshell about the emergence of Marathi Bhakti in the 13th century, and these are some of the important poets of this period. Mahim Bhatta, Mahadasya or Mahadamba, who is probably first woman poet in Marathi. Then you have Keshiraj Bas, Narendra Parashuram, Keshiraj, Narendra are from Mahanubhava sect, while Jnaneshwar, whom I will be talking about in the presentation at some length, and he had his first great circle of followers consisting of Namdev, Shimpi, the tailor, Zanabai, who is Namdev's maid, Gura Kumbhar, the potter, Sauta Mari, the gardener, Chokha Mera, the untouchable devotee, Narhari Sonar, the goldsmith, Sena Navi, the barber, and Kanopatra, the dancing girl, are all largely from Bhagwat or the Varkari sect. And poets like Mukund Raja are from Nath sect. So this is 13th century emergence, explosive emergence of Marathi Bhakti in 13th century that you can see. And if you could look at some of the names like Namdev, then Namdev, though considered as a very critical figure in Marathi Bhakti, is a kind of major presence in North Indian sects and North Indian religions like Sikh, where in Guru Granth Sahib, he is one of the major Bhagats or sons in the Bhagat Bani. So he has a presence because he is believed to have gone and lived in Punjab for 20 years. That's what the belief is. So you can see that the idea of world literature starts emerging from 13th century immediately, as you can see, that some of the figures in Marathi are a major presences in the literature and literary and cultural traditions outside Maharashtra. One of the most influential formulations or interpretations of this pre-colonial devotional literature, often, in my view, more accurately, something called Santa Vangmay rather than Bhakti literature, in Marathi is found in a very influential book called The Rise of Maratha Power by Mahadev Govind Ranade. And he is trying to critique the British historian Grant Duff, who is offering a clear view of Indian history from Indian standpoint to remove misapprehensions which detract much of moral interest and political lessons of the story. And also, and this is something very interesting, to enlist sympathy of the representatives of conquering British power in the fortune of its worsted rivals, that is the Marathas. This is something very interesting. And he goes on to say And this is what Grant Duff had offered in the beginning of 19th century, maybe 60, 70 years before Mahadev Govind Ranade talks about the rise of Marathas. He's saying that the Maratha history that emerges after 17th century, he calls it predatory spirit of Hindus. And he says that which was smothered because of Mohammedan conquerors, and its latent ember were stirred by and like parched grass kindled among forest of Sahyadri mountains. They burst forth in spreading flame, and men far off wondered at conflagration. Ranade is trying to reject the theory which is given by the colonizers that the Marathas were basically adventurers and freebooters who were solely seeking Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi, the kind of taxes in the the crumbling Mughal Empire in the 18th century. So according to the Britishers, they were largely freebooters and adventurers. And he goes on to say that the immediate predecessors of British rulers of India were not Mohammedans, but the Maratha Hindus who had asserted their positions and become independent rulers of the country, and unlike the Subedarship of Bengal, Karnataka, and rise of Maratha power was due to the first beginning of what may call process of nation building. So those who are familiar with Maratha history, it begins with the rebellion by Shivaji and established founding of independent kingdom in the later 17th century, a small kingdom, and then it goes on in the beginning of 18th century. It becomes a kind of, after the death of Aurangzeb, it spreads towards North India and to the southern India. So there's a great spread out of Marathas in the 18th century. And according to Ranade, this is the process of nation building. And that is the critical point here. Now, this is the year 1900 interpretation of a kind of a post-colonial interpretation of Bhakti. And Ranade argues that this rise of Maratha power was not mere a political revolution that stirred Maharashtra, and was preceded and to some extent caused by the religious and social upheaval which moved the entire population. This upheaval was not entirely a reaction to religious persecution, but more like the Protestant Reformation in Europe in the 16th century. There was a religious, social, literal revival and reformation in India, but notably in the Deccan in the 15th and 16th century. This religious revival was not Brahminical in its orthodoxy. It was heterodox in its spirit and its protest, but also the work of people, of the masses, and not the classes. And at the head were the saints and the prophets of the society: tailors, carpenters, potters, gardeners, shopkeepers, barbers, and even mahars, more often than the Brahmins. What Protestantism did, according to Ranade, for Western Europe in the matters of civil liberty was accomplished on a smaller scale in the Western India by the Bhakti movement, the list of the names that I have just read out. So this is one of the very famous, influential formulation of Bhakti movement in Maharashtra. It is compared to first European Protestantism, Protestant Reformation, and it is also given a kind of nationalist slant that this is, as Protestant Reformation was the driving force behind modernity and modern nation states in India, in the West. This movement was the driving force behind the rise of Marathas in the 18th century. This is the theory that Mahadev Govind Ranade has put forth. So this is one nationalist perspective. More modern, more contemporary perspective come from South Asianists who argue, for example, like Sheldon Pollock. He says that the texts during the time of 13th century onwards were part of the processes of vernacularization, or the historical process of choosing to create a written literature along with its complement, a political discourse in local languages according to the model supplied by a superordinate, usually Sanskrit. I'm sorry, I think. Yeah, Sanskrit literary culture. So how Sheldon Pollock and other South Asianists look at the rise of Bhakti is that there were Sanskrit models, Sanskrit texts, and Sanskrit genres that were desified or vernacularized, and this is what gave rise to the literary text in the 13th century onwards in Indian languages. And this is the idea that the Sanskrit, it's a kind of top-down approach. From Sanskrit, it goes to bhashas. That's what he says. And he talks about the superordinate, usually cosmopolitan literary culture. And the other word that he uses is the Sanskrit cosmopolis. For the entire space occupied by Sanskrit literature, starting from the Afghanistan to Java and all that. So it's a huge territorial, trans-regional space of Margiya Sahitya, which is Sanskrit, as against the various Deshi bhashas. So this is the process of Deshikaran, according to Sheldon Pollock. So these are the two influential approaches. I am trying to point out that both these approaches are not very different from each other, nor are they very different from Walter Cohen and others' formulation of world literature as a process of vernacularization. As if novel began in Europe and then it was Desified, then it became it was vernacularized in India. So that is the theory. And you can see that it is a kind of a problematic top-down approach that seems to be at the heart of these approaches, Walter Cohen's or Sheldon Pollock's model, where peripheral literature and Desi cultural spaces are assumed to be kind of passive receivers of the Sanskrit cultures or the trans-regional cosmopolitan cultures. So the Desi is seen as a kind of receiver, and the donors or the influencers are the European or the Sanskrit ones. While I have attempted to develop the argument that it's not a singular one, as I've said, and the South Asian vernacular, these the models that we can use for literary historiography are those proposed by Dionysius Durizen and David Damrosch, can be useful in opening up the histories of literary cultures like Marathi that interacted dialogically, not only with larger trans-regional, local cultural spaces like the Sanskrit cosmopolis or the Persian cosmopolis. That's another term that's very important in South Asian studies, advanced by Richard Eaton on the one hand, but these models, especially Dionysius Durizen and Damrosch, can help us to understand the interaction that is happening between bhashas, between bhasha and bhasha, not just Sanskrit and bhasha, not just English and bhasha, also between one bhasha and another. And this emphasis on dialogism can help us to go beyond this monolingual nationalist nativist models of literary historiography, on the one hand, as well as Sanskrit-centric neo-Orientalist models that may I request somebody who is Raghav, who is trying to remote control of my screen, which I am declining. May I request him to not do it right away? Okay, thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So we need to look at Dionysius Durizen's model of world literature at some length before we can unpack Bhakti as a world literary phenomenon. And the methodological framework that he has advanced is a kind of displacement of influence studies model, where there is one influencer and there is one influenced. So in order to eliminate this vulgarization and one-sidedness implicit in the idea of influencer causality, in the approaches such as Pollock and Cohen's, Dionysius Durizen comes up with a term called interliterariness, which Professor Amiya Dev also has mentioned in his research. And Durizin emphasizes the factor of autonomous individuality of the literary culture's title as recipient, the principle of selectivity and agency active in the recipient culture. Durizin's model of world literature as a dynamic and evolving construct that models interliterariness at several levels is far more constructive framework than compared to Eurocentric model like Moretti's or Sanskrit-centered model like Pollock. What Durizin is saying that world literature is not a fixed concept, but a kind of evolving concept. And if you look at South Asia or India, Indian subcontinent and Marathi and Gujarati or Bangla languages, then they have their own interliterary processes, and these interliterary processes have their own inbuilt understanding of world literature at all the phases. So the 19th century onwards, the colonial modern model of world literature is one more model of world literature. There always were various models of world literature before the advent of British colonialism on the subcontinent. So apart from eliminating this vulgarization and one-sidedness, what it does is that it enables us strategically to reject the customary reactionary nativist and nationalist accusation of derivativeness against the presence and the role of non-native foreign elements in tradition. And that is one of the responses that you find in nativistic and nationalistic readings of literary history, that if a form or an idea or a trope or a device or a theme has come from other culture, it's seen as derivative. It's seen as something which is from outside, so not indigenous enough. So Durizin eliminates that. So Durizinian framework eliminates these two important obstacles in formulation of literary history, which is post-nationalist, post-nativist, post-South Asianist, for the lack of better word, or post-Eurocentric, Sanskrit-centric approaches. Thus, it overcomes the typical binaristic post-colonial models. So, thus, the history of Marathi literature does not remain merely a variety of national or sub-national narrative, but emerges as the figure against the background of world literary process. And as David Damrosch has used this phrase, it allows us to see the world in the grain of sand. And the whole world that we see in the grain of Marathi sand is what I'm going to do. And this is how I have advanced the whole argument in my book. So this is a kind of argument that I'm developing in the book. So Marathi literary culture, and this is the summary of my book, developed with intense interaction with world literatures at various periods in history. World literature in Marathi can be understood as historically unfolding interliterary process where Sanskrit, Apabhansha Bhashas, that is the first phase of interliterariness till 12th and 13th century, can be the earliest phase, followed by the Persian, Arabic, Hindustani phase of 14th to 18th century. And the central media of this phase, by media I mean the medium, was oral literate cultures that consisted of both oral performative traditions as well as writing and manuscript tradition. The English Marathi, I think there is someone who is again, I think there is someone whose phone number is A15 Oppo is requesting remote control on my screen. I again request that person not to do so. The English Marathi interliterary process, 19th century onwards, the chief media at this stage was the printing technology, and with the emergence of internet as a global tool of immense power, we can believe that we are in the beginning of the next stage, the post-print phase of world literature after 1990s. That's my kind of summary of the whole book. So conceptualizing world literature and its relation to individual literary cultures as a historical process that precedes and exceeds print-centric, Eurocentric conception of world literature can help us to complicate these Eurocentric narratives of literature. And what I have done in my book is that as interliterary processes, I have also looked at how Marathi interacted with other bhashas like Kannada, like Gujarati, but like with Bangla. So this is what the model provided by Durism allows us to do, that we can also think of something called the Bangla cosmopolis, where Bangla literature and literary traditions formed an integral part of multiple literary traditions on the subcontinent. For example, in Marathi, the prominent modern Diwali Ank is modeled after the puja issues, and see how practice is transmitted rather than from the West. There were moments where there was intense love for Bangla literature. The Bengal Renaissance and the modernity also became a kind of role model for the modernities in various parts of Indian subcontinent later on. This can be understood only if we bring in the idea of interliterariness operating at multiple levels, not just English Gujarati, English Marathi, or English Bangla for that matter. So this is one way to again displace that Eurocentric view of literary history that we find. Something similar can be done about Hindi also as well. And I have also talked about how one can look at the developments like modernism and postmodernism and various social cultural movements in the West, right? They find their counterparts in Indian literary cultures, like like conservatism, like abolitionism, socialism, Marxism, fascism, feminism, cultural avant-garde, philosophical movements like psychoanalysis, existentialism, phenomenology, also transnational circulation and impact. However, because I'm going to limit myself only to the pre-colonial, because that's a slightly unobvious way of looking at literature as word literature. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's look at probably one of the most important in Marathi, starting with 13th century. One of the most influential in Marathi is a commentary on Bhagavad Gita known as the Jnaneshwari, or the Bhavartha Deepika. Jnaneshwar, 1275 to. It is also essential religious and spiritual text in Maharashtra, whose influence later development of Marathi literature culture is enormous. So while Bhagavad Gita comprises of 700 plus shloka in Anushta meter, the Jnaneshwari is a commentary that runs into 9,000 OVs and OV folk genre. And I will talk about that slightly later. So what does, why is it interliterary and not vernacularization of Sanskrit genre? Is that Sanskrit Tika or Bhashya genre, and most famous are the Shankaracharya's and Ramanuja's commentary on Bhagavad Gita. Jnaneshwari involves, the Sanskrit model involves commentary and gloss of philosophically ambivalent terms, and is meant primarily for literate upper caste elite reader. But when you use Desi Bhashas, Deshikar, Lene as it is called, and you use a folk meter, OV, and OV was a folk genre that was used very often by women in houses when they used to pestle, grind the floor while they were drawing waters from what is known as rahat. So this is a folk genre that Jnaneshwar is using to comment on probably one of the most technical texts in Sanskrit literature. So it is not simple deification, but a kind of creative invention of a new genre, right? And it is a performative text, and it is in the context of Dharma Kirtan. He calls it Dharma Kirtan in front of Maharashtra Mandali. That's the phrase he uses. So this is about Ovi. It's Janpad Ovi was Ovi that was sung by women while working at grindstone. While Granthika Ovi is a later development which becomes Granth Ovi, that is used in literary Granth. It becomes the established canonical genre because it has brought, because of kind of construction, blending together, an interliterary blending together of Sanskrit, high Sanskrit textuality with the folk into inverted comma together and form a new genre in itself. So this process is the interliterary process of semiotic transformation of the text, a translation of its kind. And this is what I mean when I say that their Sanskrit texts were not simply. May I request somebody called Raghav not to request a remote control of my screen. Okay. And you can see that it has the Marathi commentary on Bhagavad Gita is an unusual type of dialogism compared to the Sanskrit version, where the Gita is framed around discussion of Sanjay and Dhritarashtra, within which you can see and hear Krishna having a dialogue with Arjuna. Jnaneshwari is framed as Dharma Kirtan. Kirtan is singing the praises of the Lord, and it is the addressor is Jnaneshwar himself, and he is in company of Maharashtra Mandali, and you can see how the idea of Maharashtra Mandali exists in 13th century onwards and consists of saints or santa as well as his Guru Nivruttinath, who interrupts Jnaneshwar when he is digressing, saying that enough, you don't have to tell us all this, be quick and give your thought to the work in hand. So it's a strange dialogue, the dialogue between the santas and Jnaneshwar with his guru nearby, who tells him that, come on, don't digress and stay online, kind of thing. And the whole work is full of beautiful, flamboyant metaphoricity and digression is what makes it intensely poetic. In fact, it is far more poetic than the original Bhagavad Gita, which is more spiritual and philosophically grounded. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say Bhakti beyond vernacularization. So it's not kind of unidirectional, one-way transmission between Sanskrit and Bhasha that was happening here. What is happening here is literary relations, as Cesar Dominguez has talked about in context of Durison's theory, that literary relations never develop between just two elements, but at several levels simultaneously, such as, for instance, between the source element and the target element, and the respective context between the source and target systems and their context. So what I'm trying to argue is that the Desi-Margiya binary of the influential and influence not only reinforces the hegemonic place of Sanskrit or English, but also fails to take into account these interliterary relations happening at multiple levels in the Bhasha kind, or in the Bhasha canon of literary history. In my book, I have also tried to look beyond the idea of Bhakti as reformation. And my argument always has been, when it comes to Bhakti, is that most of the readings of Bhakti as a kind of socially emancipatory, modern kind of projects is an anachronistic one. Most of the ideas of equality and inclusiveness that you find in Bhakti are largely in spiritual domain, in the paramarthic domain. The param artha is the moksha. And it's on your way to moksha that these inequalities make no sense. And ahamkar, or the ego, which is the chief obstacle for any devotee, may be of any kind. It may be an ego of your caste, it may be ego of your gender, it may be ego of your wealth, has no place in bhakti or in paramarthika domain. But to read it as a project of social transformation of a modern kind is an anachronistic one and a modern reading. And it's based on very selective reading of bhakti. And as an example, I have stated this, that Jnaneshwari says that unlike Vedas, which are krupan or miserly, because they avoid touching the ears of Shudra and women, Gita is that distinctive generosity personified to overcome the debt by being accessible to the masses. Jnaneshwari glorifies the superiority of Brahmins and even instructs the Brahmin not to eat the food cooked at the Shudra's home, even if it is delicious, which points at how on one hand you talk of certain kind of inclusiveness, but on the other, you want to reinforce the Varna Jati hierarchy because the transformation of Varna Jati hierarchy in the social domain was never a project of Bhakti literature, in my opinion. It was largely in the spiritualistic path that these kind of things make no sense. Okay, so now I come to the next phase of world literature in Marathi literary historiography and Marathi literary history. And that is also a very interesting one. And it is Bhakti in the dark ages of the Persian cosmopolis, as I have put it. The idea of Persian cosmopolis is obviously developed by Richard Eaton on the lines of Sanskrit cosmopolis by Sheldon Pollock, as you are aware. But Marathi nationalist historiography calls this period as Tamo Yuga, or the Dark Age, the period between mid 14th century to 17th century, before the rise of the Maratha movement, or before the rise of Maratha confederacy, for lack of better word. It was definitely not Maratha Empire, as many nationalist historians have put it. And many people have been skeptical about the use of confederacy also. Anyway, but this is what Marathi historiographers have used. They have called this period as Asmani Sultani period. By Asmani Sultani, you mean catastrophe from Asman, from the sky, but also because of the sultans. So you can see that because of the Islamic regimes of various kinds that the Deccan was ruled over by, there was a Tamo Yuga, or the dark age of Marathi literary history. And this idea is so deeply entrenched, and I will give you some example. One of the most leading historians of Marathi literary history is S.G. Tolpule, who calls it Tamo Yuga, because it is a dark night that would not go on very long because of Muslim invasion, not primarily because of Muslim, but because of cultural decadence in the Marathi society. It has lost its authentic character. That's what he says. Another history by Paranspe and Miraskar would call this era of darkness. From 350, that was the year in which Namdev was supposed to have died, to the rise of Eknath in the mid 16th century. This phase is the era of dark ages, according to these historians. That is because the pattern of Marathi given by the Yadavas came to the end. The infiltration of Muslim Sufis into the culture. This led to the downfall of culture, according to these people. And this characterization of nationalist historiography also finds its takers among nativist scholars like Bhalchandra Nemade, who would hold that medieval Marathi literature was certainly a part of Maharashtrian assertion of independence against Muslim invaders, a part of Indian Reformation which began with the loss of political freedom. Nemade goes on to say that the fanatical Muslim powers had reduced the Hindu population to social impotence, leading to total submission to all kinds of authoritarianism. It is no wonder that in a great disorder caused by political confusion of the war, no great literature flourished in Maharashtra after 13th century. So 14th, 15th and 16th centuries were the barren period of Marathi literature, says Nemade, excepting one major poet, that is Eknath. 300 years, for these 300 years, we did not have any significant writer. This problem in Marathi literary historiography is connected with larger historical problem discussed by Brajdural Chattopadhyay in regarding the typical schematic division of pre-British Indian history into Hindu and Muslim periods, which results in construction of homogeneous political cultural entities which are by nature changeless and can be considered as very homogeneous and static. In my own project of literary historiography, I have an alternate tentative periodization in order to underscore the dynamic and complex nature of various Islamic regimes, heterogeneous and fluid natures of what we mean by Muslim and Hindus identities as well, and their various militaristic and cultural projects, and the shifting and contingent nature of this relationship. I have also drawn upon John Abbott Wall, who has talked about how Islamic world can be considered as a special pre-modern world system. The Deccan and the later entire subcontinent became part of this Islamic world or Persian cosmopolis. And this is where the next stage of interliterariness and world literature in Marathi seems to emerge, and I'm sure in many other South Asian languages as well. And we have a new kind of interliterary development, which is a kind of continuing engagement with Sanskrit cosmopolis as well as Bhasha encounters as with Marathi and Kannada and so on and so forth. My own reading of this period is that this period of 200 years was not blank, nor were there any dark ages. A significant development in this period is the emergence of new sampradayas like the Dattatreya Sampradaya, Ananda Sampradaya, Nagesh Sampradaya, and their literatures, as well as emergence of Jaina literature and Muslim Marathi Santas in Marathi, as well as Dakhini literatures by the Sufis. So these are the developments of this period. I am not going into details about all this because of lack of time, obviously. But we will take a look at a very important Muslim Marathi poet who is contemporary of Eknath, whose name is Shah Muntoji or Mudbujji Brahmani, or also called Mrutyunjay. That's the title. And he's a Sant Kavi, and many people claim that he's a Sufi, but with the dividing line between Sufi and Muslim Sant is a very fuzzy one that needs to be looked into. Well, some historians place him, and that is a very typical problem about what do we know about that poet, is that he's thought to be the king of Bidar, but then it's unlikely. Some scholars hold that his dates are 1620 onwards, or some people place him in 1575 to 1650. Y.M. Pathan places him in the end of 15th century and the beginning of 16th century. A fascinating book attributed to Shah Muntoji, Mrutyunjay, is Siddha Sanket Prabandha, which is in the form of Anuvad of Padma Puran, a dialogue on knowledge and spirituality between Ram and Sita. His other smaller books are the Advaita Prakash and Prakash Deep, also Swarup Samadhan and Amrutanubhav, the Jiva Dharma. These books largely express the Upanishadic Vedantic thought, and this is why I always feel that reduction of Upanishadic and Vedantic philosophy to Brahminism by the people on left is also fairly reductive and simplistic, because not only were Santas outside the fold of Chaturvarna upholding this Upanishadic doctrine, but also Muslim Sant poets were actually upholding and writing literature based on Upanishadic and Vedantic thought. So reduction of Vedanticism to Brahminism is, I think, in my view, is not historically all that simple. But very interesting book is Panchikarana, and Panchikarana are the five elements coming together and the creation of the universe narrative. Attributed to Muntoji is a kind of glossary of Marathi and Sanskrit spiritual terms translated into what is known as Avindha or Muslim language. So here is a book which is a glossary of spiritual terms from Marathi to either Hindustani or some Muslim language that he is mentioning. And this kind of glossary by a Muslim Sant poet talks about, can be seen as a kind of project of search for some spiritual common ground and equivalence, right, which transcends religious and caste boundaries. And this equivalence, this glossary is a glossary of translations, obviously. And when Om Ram could be translated as Bismillah in those days, in the good old days of Muslim regimes. However, the intellectual efforts to find spiritual ground and spiritual equivalences between Islamic theological terms and Sanskrit in Panchakarana is extremely significant for cultural history of subcontinent. For instance, it says Om Ram is equivalent to Bismillah. Stula Deha is glossed as Wajbul Wajud, and Linga Deha is translated as Mamatal Wajud. When these texts were composed, the historicity is pretty unclear. But the text says that the glossary was prepared in response to the queries asked by the great figure of Nagesh Sampradaya called Adnyan Siddha to his disciple, Muslim disciple, Mrityunjay. And characteristic eclecticism of the Sampradaya, the Nagesh Sampradaya, is as well as its own theological vocabulary is a distinctive feature of this book. It does highlight importance of sects and their ideologies as important institutional context of most of pre-colonial literature. A note in Panchikaran says, Shah Mudbajji Bahamani, Jinme nahi manmani, Panchikaran ka khoj kiye, Hindu Musalman ek kiye, is self-explanatory. Shah Mudbajji Brahmani did not, as per his whims and fancies, he discovered Panchikarana and united Hindus and Muslims. That is what it says. Another significant, and this is the last point that I am making, as an example of how Marathi literary culture developed in intense dialogic interaction with the Persian cosmopolis as well as Sanskrit cosmopolis, is far more famous name of Sheikh Muhammad from 1575 to 1674, who is also considered as avatar of Kabir. The famous saying in Marathi is that Jnanacha Eka, Kabiracha Shekha. Jnaneshwar, so Eka or Eknath is Jnaneshwar's, and Sheikh Muhammad belongs to Kabir. That's what it says. So Sheikh Muhammad's Yog Sangram is an allegorical narrative that depicts the war, Sangram, between self and the ego, Aham. And the scholar R.C. Dere has drawn attention to close parallels between Jnaneshwari, Kabir's poetry and Yoga Sangram. So you can see that what is known as Marathi, into inverted commas, a literary tradition has drawn upon elements from multiple regions, religions, cultures, languages in order to build its own poetics as the history unfolded. And this process of incorporation of various non-Marathi elements into Marathi can be understood as interliterary, world literary processes. Text attributed to Sheikh Muhammad is Ducheshma, or a pair of eyes. Ducheshma is eyes, which is similar to Muntaji's Panchikaran, but more clearly Sufi in its outlook, provides Marathi equivalents to Sufi theological terminology. So while Muntaji's Panchikaran was a kind of glossary between the sectarian theology of Nagesh Sampradaya and the Islamic theology, Panchikaran seems to be more of Sufi and Marathi equivalents. It also seems to suggest that spiritually both Islamic and the Vedantic Bhakti traditions are like two eyes looking at a single reality. This interliterary condition is significant characteristic of the period where Kabir and Islamic theology can be considered as world literary along with Vedantic thought. That was largely Sanskrit to start with, but did not remain only Sanskrit, as we have already seen in Jnaneshwari's commentary on Bhagavad Gita. So this is the what I'm trying to say. Thus, by conceptualizing these histories as cross-lingual, cross-regional, cross-religious dialogic interactions and circulations as world literary process, we can come up with post-nationalist, post-nativist, non-Eurocentric, non-essentialistic models of literary and cultural historiographies in South Asia. And these are the works that I have cited. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. These are the small sections of my book. There are many great Bhakti poets which I have looked at in my book. And given the time constraint, I can think of these two. I would have loved to talk about Marathi Jaina literature, which is fascinating development in itself of world literary kind, where a lot of interaction happened between Gujarat and Maharashtra, places where I live. And this dialogue was very important in formation of Marathi Jain canon. So with this, I want to stop my presentation here, and I would be very happy to interact with all of you, learn from you, your observations, insights, queries, questions that all of you have. And again, I want to thank CC University and Professor Rindan Kundu and Dr. Rakesh Tripathi for having me here and giving me an opportunity to share from my book. So thank you once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I think it's now time for questions from the participants. And we already have some questions. I'll place the questions now, sir.
Yeah.
One of the participants, Ajay Chushar, asks, interregional literary interaction is so less, and Indian English has become the mediator between Indian literatures in last some years. So how can we formulate a model of world literature in regional languages in today's times?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because the decline of inter-regional dialogue seems to be a modern development, and it seems to be connected in some way with the rise of English as a kind of language that is depriving people of their first language competencies in some way. And I see that in what is known as subtractive bilingualism in sociolinguistic term, that you acquire English at the cost of other languages, is a modern globalized development. However, if you look at the pre-colonial period, then the interaction was far more intense, as we can see here. And that happened without any technology or communication technology. And the only technology was oral performances, and people going for parikrama and pilgrimages would take the texts around. So somebody would come to Dwarka. So Namdev would go to Dwarka, would go to Punjab, and then there would be his compositions in Hindustani and Punjabi as well. And there would be all the poets, major Bhakti poets in Marathi of Warkaris that have been bilingual, because they have composed not only in Marathi but also in Hindustani. which is a very interesting thing. And as I mentioned about the Jain Marathi literature, it developed in a kind of intense give and take with Gujarat, which was the center of Jainism in those periods. So I think that while we are coming together because of globalization and colonialism, we are also, I think, cutting off each other because we don't care for other people's language, or we assume that other person is also English speaking. So that's what I feel. But very interesting question. I hope I have responded to it.
Sure, Mr. Ajay he has received the response. And of course, we also need to reflect on the fact that English was primarily a sort of link language. Using it for literature is something that we thought of only later on. And in recent times, probably it's being used so extensively that we think that Indian English is what can give us a better idea of world literature. Somewhere, I think we need to move beyond that.
Just request, there are many people who have privately asked me questions. I think in a seminar setup, it would be better if other people also learn about their questions.
There is one more question, sir.
Yeah, so I request everybody who has messaged me privately to maybe message me into the group chat so that I can respond, so that everybody gets what I'm talking about.
So I'll proceed with this question at the moment.
Yeah.
How world literature theory can help in development of a regional theoretical framework for regional literature?
So that's what I have developed, right?
Yes.
What my presentation was about. So I wanted to build a theory of literary historiography, drawing upon ideas of world literature. So that is one way of doing it, as I have said. So my entire presentation was how to go about doing it.
So if we have other questions, I think those can be posted on the chat and we can have them taken up.
There's several questions to me. Okay. How important is literary historiography in emancipating underprivileged sects? I don't know if you mean by underprivileged castes or sects. I'm not very sure what you mean by sects, or is it caste? But if you, yeah. Underprivileged sects, how can literary historiography, by being more inclusive and treating the canonical with the marginal at par. I think that is one way in by which you can have a more intense dialogue and equality within literary historiography. I think that is one way of doing it. Okay. I have in PowerPoint, I have kept the work cited list, which I think you can use for reference. Those people who are asking me whether you recommend certain books, then all those books I think can be considered as a kind of suggested reading, further reading.
There's yet another question. This is from Dr. Mrinmoy, who asks, early Bengali literary history also talks about Dark Age, and interestingly, this notion is common to almost all the Bhasha literary history. Bengali literary historians perhaps hide the Brahmin king's oppression to the Buddhists and talk about Muslim invasion. Could you please elaborate the idea of Dark Age in context of Marathi and Gujarati?
Well, that's what I did, right? I pointed out how the idea of Dark Age is a misnomer, and it comes from certain ideological biases and also sectarian biases of certain kind. Because if you look at Marathi literary history from point of view of Varkaris, right, then you will see that there are no major poets between Namdev and Eknath. right? But then there was so much other literature which goes into background. That is what underprivileged sect would imply probably. There were other sectarian formations which were extremely potent, like Marathi Jain literature, which is recently being dug up, excavated. Then Marathi Muslim literature, Muslim saint literature is also something that is being marginalized very strongly. So if we give up, or if we keep this ideological bias aside, then we can look at literary history in a more neutral way, which will reveal so many hidden dimensions, so that there is no such thing like dark ages and there are no such thing like golden ages, because as somebody was saying, the golden ages can be very oppressive, as probably the 13th century history bears to testimony. Like Jnaneshwar was himself a victim of caste, and in spite of being a Brahmin, right? So the oppressive histories all the way around, even in the period considered as golden age. So I am against using such kind of descriptive, evaluative, normative, ideologically loaded terms for periodization. And coming to the question of Buddhism, because I think somebody asked me a question in private about Buddhism and vernacularization. I think Buddhism, at least in Jnaneshwari, is seen as an enemy, right? So there is a kind of Brahmin versus Buddhist war that seems to be underway, and slowly Buddhism declines due to several reasons apart from the onslaught on Buddhists from the Brahminical establishment, but also because Buddhism turns into something that very much resembles, which is no different from Brahminic Hinduism in terms of Tantra and whatnot, as it's so prominent in Bengali literary histories. But very interesting commentary on a Buddhist text called Vajrasuchi Upanishad is done by a very prominent Marathi Bhakti poet called Bahanabai, who was the follower of Tukaram in the 17th century. And she uses this Vajrasuchi Upanishad, which is a full-fledged attack on Varna system, probably by Buddhist philosophers. We don't know who are the composers of it. But she writes a commentary in Marathi on Vajrasuchi Upanishad, and given the fact that her guru, Tukaram, was a Shudra, and she was a Brahmin, she came under attack from the Brahminical establishment, that how can you have a Brahmin as a guru? And that is her response to it. So, and it is the Buddhist text which is vernacularized? No, but maybe maybe created as a genre of commentary for contemporary ideological purposes. So, and Buddhism, of course, very famously is revived by Dr. Ambedkar in 1940s onwards. So that's about Buddhism. Okay. Are there other questions?
I don't think so. We have any other question? Professor Kundu, do we have any question at your end?
There is a question called, what is Tantra? Well, Tantra was a system of beliefs and practices and worldviews that seem to go beyond the established Shruti Smriti traditions, right? And you can see those developments in Buddhism as well as Brahminism, as well as largely in Shaivas, Vaishnavites. So Tantra is a kind of system made up of multiple systems of all kinds. But it goes beyond the Vedic Shruti tradition. It doesn't mean it's a rejection of it. Right. We find those things developing after 5th century onwards. Or can any literary history qualify to be considered as world just on basis of translation, especially the dominant language, but lacks something in content, which is just on the basis of translation? I think translation is a major canonizing force. translation in a broader sense of refraction and rewriting, like Bhairava's commentary on Vajrasuchi Upanishad is also a form of translation. So it may have a kind of contestational value as well. It's not always canonical. So translations can be contestatory as well as canonical at the same time. I hope that is. There is a question which says that on hegemonic status of English and Sanskrit in the context of world literature. Well, that's what I have been saying, right? How the hegemonic status comes from the idea of influence. So if we replace the idea of influence by interliterary processes, then we can displace this influencer-influenced paradigm. And that is one way to, I think, overcome this hierarchic model of literature as well as modernity. How did Sanskrit enrich Indian language? Well, I gave you an example that most of the epics, the classical texts like Puranic texts had the commentaries in the bhashas, whether it's Bhagavad Puran or whether it is Ramayana or Mahabharata or Bhagavad Gita. Interestingly, the Vedic texts are, in my knowledge, never translated into bhashas. It's only not the text translated. It's only the Puranic and the Itihasa which is translated, which tells us a lot about the implicit caste system in the literary canon. Logical sound to label Sanskrit as Deva Bhasha, well, that is the traditional description of it. It depends whether you believe in Deva or not. But that is the traditional label given to Sanskrit. Can memory be an important tool for formulating world literature? Very much. And I think Kristen Lee Nowitzki's work on Namdev is one of the best examples of use of how cultural history and memory can be conceptual tools for writing literary histories. I think Samparan Chakravarti can look up Kristen Lee Nowitzki's book on history, memory, in the context of Namdev. If there are more questions, how can we as academicians give voice to the unrecognized folk literature compared to elites? I think one way is by engaging with it, commenting on it, translating it, bringing into the folds of the elite institutional canons and elite institutional frameworks like syllabus. That is one way of doing it.
Thank you so much for the wonderful answers, sir.
My pleasure. Thanks everyone for those questions as well.
In fact, on the fourth day, I feel that a journey that we started 4 days ago, or the first session and the one that we have today, we are still trying to map what world literature is, and every time we find that there's some addition to the concept. Today, when we started with your session,
as an evolving idea rather than a fixed notion.
Yes. In fact, the moment the term Bhakti came, probably everyone felt that it's going to be something related to vernacular or something within the state or the nation. But relating the term to a global context is something that actually happened today. We could see it happening. We could see the correlations that you drew of Bhakti tradition with other traditions, be it religious or spiritual, or even literary. It was a wonderful experience to understand all those wonderful intricacies of literature.
Thank you.
In fact, I can see whatever you said some very interesting points which I'd like to just mention as we conclude, that it's not just a single concept, rather multiple models are at work, and especially the concept of multiple models is especially relevant in present times. We cannot ignore it. And we could see how Marathi literature was, it played an influential role in influencing literature of the other states and movements happening in other parts of the country. And the movement that was led in during the rise of the Maratha power, how it helped in nation building, simply because of the fact that it was a movement led by the masses, not the classes. And of course, I also learned this new linguistic cosmopolis that you talked of today, one of Sanskrit and the other Persian. I'm sure many more would evolve gradually once your book is there. People will try to find out many more.
I mentioned Bangla cosmopolis as well.
So, and rightly said that world literature is not a fixed concept, it's evolving. And I think today's session took us through that evolution. And I'd say it was a journey of around 700 years of evolution that we looked at in such a short span of time, in about 1 hour's time. I must thank you. I must congratulate you for the wonderful literary cartography that you did today. When I saw the flyer of the program where map of literature was written, I was trying to relate it to today's session, and I could see it was a wonderful literary cartography. Only after that, we could have covered 700 years of literary evolution in such a short span of time. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, sir. We are highly indebted to you for sharing this wonderful piece of knowledge with us. Thank you so much again. And Professor Indic Kundu.
Thanks for having me, all of you. Professor
I'm
Rindu.
extremely grateful to Professor Sachin Ketkar for accepting my invitation. Thank you, sir. I hope that we will have you soon in our beautiful campus. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Tripathi, for chairing the session so beautifully. I thank all
Thanks,
my
sir.
colleagues, students, and all the respected participants for showing interest in this webinar series. Next talk will be on 13th. I will see you on 13th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.